For about 2 months, I've been writing and rewriting a gargantuan treatise on the story of Dawntrail now that patch 7.3 officially concluded the expansion's narrative. That script is not the one that I'm reading to you now. I realized after 10 or 20,000 words that none of you out there need to be convinced that Dawntrail as a story is an unmitigated disaster and a complete betrayal of the standard of writing quality that Final Fantasy XIV built its reputation upon. Besides, others have already done a better job at that than I ever could. So what is this video about? What could I possibly have to say about this expansion story that hasn't already been said before? This video is about a theory, something of a conspiracy theory you might say, which is enshrined within the title of the video. Wuk Lamat should never have existed. That isn't clickbait or sensationalism, that is the heart, the only explanation that I can provide to you all for Creative Studio 3's decision to draw the rest of the horse that way. I'll lay it out for you. It's my opinion that Dawntrail, during its earliest stages of development, was not about Wuk Lamat, and that her character was inserted into the plot later for reasons that I'll speculate on at the end of the video. To take it a step further, after examining the totality of Dawntrail's narrative over the last 2 months and discussing the story with friends and many of my viewers for over a year, I contend without a shadow of a doubt that Dawntrail was meant to be a story about Kona. You're skeptical, I understand. The video's only just begun, after all, but I'm confident that by the time I lay out my theory in full and this video reaches its apex, even the most skeptical of you will realize that I am correct. Dawntrail is a narrative catastrophe rife with contrivances, inconsistent characterizations, and an inability to maturely tackle its own themes. And it all stems from, in my estimation, a desperate pivot away from one protagonist to another, which required a gargantuan effort to restructure a plot that was built for Kona and not for Wuk Lamat. An effort which ultimately ended in failure. Get comfortable, ladies and gentlemen, this is why Wuk Lamat should never have existed. Let's start at the beginning. January 16th, 2024. Final Fantasy XIV released patch 6.55 to set the stage for the release of Dawntrail. In that patch, we were introduced to the cat of the hour herself, Wuk Lamat, who quickly pitches the Warrior of Light to infiltrate a foreign country and sway a political power struggle in her favor. While I appreciate that the writer seemed to recognize the absurdity of the situation for a brief moment, what with this head of a foreign state sailing across an ocean to conscript us for her campaign with nary a platform or a slogan to work with, the dialogue option to say, "Get your politics out of my video games," was refreshing, yet ultimately futile. We're then treated to an extended point-by-point presentation of Wuk Lamat's personality traits. All of her ambitions, her anxieties, her bravado. All the while, there's another character off-screen in the exact same location, interacting with many of the same people and places that we already spent a substantial portion of the expansion interacting with, who happens to come from the same country and who shares the same ambitions and anxieties as Wuk Lamat. I am, of course, referring to everyone's favorite nerd with a gun, Kona. I want you to really consider the logistics of the situation. The writers decided that it would be more believable to put Wuk Lamat on a boat and have her sail across an ocean in order to recruit the savior of the universe, with absolutely no guarantee that he or she would accept the challenge. Meanwhile, it would have taken Kona roughly 75 seconds to lightly stroll from the studium to wherever you are to make the same proposition. Then there's the pitch itself. Consider the situation. There's a foreign nation that is preparing to undergo a generational transfer of power. For some reason, the process of that transfer of power has been reduced to a scavenger hunt between a trueborn heir and his adopted siblings. And also this guy. Wuk Lamat is determined to win the right of succession to prevent her brother, Zoralja, from plunging the nation into a war of conquest and to preserve the peace that her beloved father secured when he united the disparate peoples of Tural. Ultimately, that is the same goal as Kona's, except Wuk Lamat is missing the how. Kona values technology and progress to a fault. His entire character arc is about learning to put people before progress. And the story goes to great lengths to reveal that his methods are overwhelmingly successful, so the only flaw in Kona's motivation is that it doesn't center people, it centers progress. Between Zoralja and Kona, Dawntrail has dueling ideologies vying for control over a nation. Both men have a unique vision for the future of Tuliolal. With more competent writing, we could have had a version of Zoralja who had compelling justifications for his ambition to militarize the country. There could have been a mounting foreign threat on the borders of Tuliolal, or a famine that has left the people starving and desperate, inspiring Zoralja to pursue conquest for vital resources. I don't know, anything would have been more interesting than what we've got. So where does Wuk Lamat fit into the picture? Her ambition is to change nothing, to preserve the status quo. She wants to prevent the war that Zoralja promises, but she has no independent vision for the future of the country that she hopes to rule over. Her grand desire is to keep a country that she is completely ignorant about encased in amber. Where there should be a compelling motivation, there is only a vacuum. My explanation is, as you might have guessed, that this redundancy is due to the fact that Wuk Lamat did not exist when the writers thought up the rite of succession. Being inserted into the story after the fact, there was little room for her motivation to take that wasn't already occupied more substantially by Kona. So let's imagine the pitch to participate in the rite without Wuk Lamat. Kona arrives for the first time, camera panning from the floor to his ears as he strides towards you, before making his grand proposition. I am the son of the Dawn Servant of Tuliyollal. My brother seeks the throne to plunge our nation into a war of conquest. I want to bring the knowledge of the studium to my people to improve their lives and secure their futures. Help me take the throne before my brother destroys it. Now, I'm not just writing fanfiction here. Let me explain why I believe that the scene I just described to you was likely how Dawntrail played out in the early stages of its development. First, it's a more economical use of characters, of established locales, and of Endwalker's world building. Obviously, Endwalker heavily featured the studium as an antagonistic force, an expository device, and as a way to help our heroes save the universe. To then feature a character from the studium to be the protagonist of a new expansion set in the new world creates a running thread between the stories. Plus, having spent so many years studying in Old Charlian, Kona also struggles with being a fish out of water upon returning to Tural, just like Wuk Lamat, yet another redundancy between their characters, although it's more believable in Kona's case, since he was gone for years and Wuk Lamat wasn't. Let's also not neglect to mention that if it was Kona that we were dealing with, then the writers wouldn't have had to justify Wuk Lamat, who is notably prone to seasickness and who is the potential heir to a kingdom, sailing across the ocean alone, with no guarantee that she would secure the Warrior of Light's support in her campaign. It doesn't make sense. It isn't economical storytelling. Second, everything that happened to Wuk Lamat in her introductory storyline would have been more fitting if it had happened to Kona. There are two notable events during Growing Light when Wuk Lamat was introduced. First, the hunt, then dinner. Wuk suggests the hunt so as to ingratiate herself to the Warrior of Light, but remember why we went on the hunt in the first place. Surveyors at the Aetherfont had called for help with a dangerous creature. These surveyors could just as well have been peers of Kona's, giving the situation more urgency for him personally and accomplishing the classic scriptwriting trope of saving the cat for our new protagonist. Wuk Lamat's anxiety in battle would have also been more befitting for Kona, who doesn't share Wuk's imposing form and who doesn't wield a weapon as threatening as an axe that's as tall as two Lalafells in a trench coat. Then, of course, there is the dinner scene. Wuk's intolerance for spicy food is played for laughs and to endear her to the audience, but again, it is very difficult to believe that this hulking warrior would struggle with tolerating spicy food. It's quickly established that Wuk Lamat loves tacos, and listen, I'm just not gonna buy that a person who is as enthusiastic about tacos as Wuk Lamat is hasn't built up a tolerance to spicy food. You just can't sell me on that. Now, imagine Kona in that seat, struggling to keep his collected composure as the pain builds. It makes more sense, doesn't it? He's a nerdy bookworm who's distanced himself from the culture of his homeland in pursuit of foreign knowledge and who's probably subsisted entirely on Archon loaf for years. Being intolerant to spicy food for someone with that kind of palate makes more sense. The third and final point for this section is in anticipation of a counterpoint that at least one of you is already writing in the comments. I imagine that you're writing something along the lines of, but Ember, if Wuk Lamat was removed from the story and the plot focused entirely on Kona, then there wouldn't be a reason for Thancred and Urianger to travel to the New World to support Kona's claim to the throne and oppose you. Of course, you are correct. While the removal of Wuk Lamat from the story would undoubtedly make it more economical, my theory undermines the most crucial pillar of Dawntrail's storyline, which, as you know, is the conflict between the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. Can you guys believe that Yoshida himself went on stage during the first reveal of Dawntrail at FanFest and he sold us on the Scions being pitted against each other? Full transparency, I thought that was a great idea. I mean, what kind of enemy do you give these characters after they've saved the universe? Why not each other? So here's my rebuttal. 14 has done a wonderful job of depicting characters who are ideologically opposed to our protagonists as sympathetic and relatable. Yotsuyu and Fordola are notable examples. So what if the Scions became embroiled in a foreign power struggle and opposed one another on an ideological basis rather than simply a plot contrivance? At the time, I had full faith that the writers could handle an internal strife between this beloved cast of characters. I was wrong, of course, but how was I supposed to know then what I know now? That plot-essential, exciting internal conflict between the Scions culminated into a single animation from Thancred during Dawntrail's first dungeon, like a programmed automaton that you drift past on a Disney ride. So if we were to imagine a version of Dawntrail with Kona as the sole protagonist and with Wuk Lamat on the cutting room floor, then the conflict between the Scions wouldn't make sense, except in the version of Dawntrail that we have, it also doesn't make sense. This so-called internal conflict is yet another plot contrivance, which only came into existence as a result of needing to salvage some semblance of structure in a messy plot. A mess that was created by shoving an overpowering and ubiquitous character into the forefront of a story that wasn't designed for her. The more that I examine this introductory storyline, the more obvious it becomes that these scenes were not written for Wuk Lamat. They were written for Kona, and Wuk Lamat was inserted over them after the fact. In its current form, the writing isn't economical, the logistics of the situation aren't believable, and the characterization of Wuk is just inconsistent. Listen, we've only scratched the surface of this examination, and we haven't even made it to the expansion proper, but maybe you're already beginning to understand why I'm putting this theory forward. As we get further into Dawntrail's story, I think you'll find that the evidence supporting my claim that Wuk Lamat should never have existed to be more than a little compelling. Let me ask you a question. What exactly was Dawntrail about? Think about it, really. What was the central theme? On some level, one might answer that question by pointing to the idea of peace through mutual understanding that Wuk Lamat's character embodied, but I think that the central theme is learning to let go. I mean, you've got Erenville and Kafkiwa, Kral and her parents, Wuk Lamat and both her father and her surrogate mother. There are other examples too, the Mamulja letting go of their ambition to produce more blessed siblings, Kona letting go of his ambition to become Dawn Servant, the Endless letting go of their facsimile of existence. Not to mention that the characters who aren't willing to let go are poised as the villains, right? Zeralja can't let go of his eternal grudge against his father. Endless Fiend can't let go of her directive. Calyx doesn't want to let go of his existence. You would be hard-pressed to convince me that letting go wasn't the core thematic tenet of Dawntrail, which makes it more than a little bit like Endwalker. Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue that Kona being the protagonist instead of Wuk Lamat would have changed any of that, because I don't really believe that it would. However, there is a different thematic thread across the two halves of Dawntrail, one being the right and the second being Alexandria, if Kona was in the leading role instead, which is the theme of people over progress. That theme, in my opinion, is more consistent with the events of the plot, and it allows for a more satisfying conclusion to the conflict stemming from the cultural clash between Tuliolal and Solution 9. What's my evidence? Let's start with Calyx. Set as a foil for Wuk Lamat, Calyx is a weird villain. His ambition is an extension of Endless Fiend's directive, an eternal hellbent on prolonging his existence at all costs. Wuk Lamat is a lover of peace, and she seemed to be as smitten as the rest of us were with Fiend's character design, but that's kind of the extent of her philosophical opposition to Calyx. She opposes him strictly on the basis that he hurts people that Fiend likes, and she doesn't like that. Not a bad reason per se, but not as interesting if you put Kona in her place. Against Wuk Lamat, Calyx is just a bad guy. Against Kona, Calyx is a warped reflection of the self, a premonition which reveals the logical conclusion of Kona's untouched worldview: progress over people. Calyx has dedicated himself to solving the greatest problem in the universe, the inescapable consequence of life which hangs over all beings like an eternal sword of Damocles: death. And he has spared no expense in achieving that end, exhausting every available resource, including the people of Alexandria. Not to give the narrative of Dawntrail more credence than it deserves, but the dynamic that could have existed between Kona and Calyx is at least somewhat interesting, as it reveals a sort of Jungian shadow to the story's protagonist, forcing him to confront himself as much as defeat his adversary. I would argue that, with Kona in the lead role instead, the defeat of Calyx cements Kona's character arc from a dispassionate inventor to a leader who puts people over progress, a stark condemnation of the villain's worldview. Or you just get this. So there's that piece of evidence. Now, let's zoom out a bit. Just look at the setting of the latter half of Dawntrail. I mean, seriously, just look at this place. Then look at him. Solution 9 is as much a foil as Calyx is to Kona, not to Wuk Lamat. For Wuk, she's just a fish out of water when she's walking in front of this gigantic graphics card. For Kona, he's being given a glimpse of his ideal vision for the future of Tudal, which is dripping with irony. Witness your utopia. All of your hopes and dreams manifest and despair. Now that is good writing. Remember the driving motivation behind Kona's campaign for the throne. The Rite of Succession was an opportunity to transform Tudal into something different, something better. You could easily imagine that if Kona had access to all of the time and resources that Calyx had, that Tuliolal would resemble a place like Solution 9 eventually. Therein lies the crux of the story, the moral lesson of Kona's character arc. He gets a taste of everything he's ever wanted, only to realize that there's more to life than progress, thus confirming that he is a worthy heir to the throne. I mean, it's so easy. This idea that Dawntrail was originally written for Kona and not for Wuk Lamat becomes increasingly obvious whenever you take 2 minutes to consider the entire sequence of the expansion's events. From Wuk Lamat barging onto the scene to Creative Studio 3 desperately declaring that somehow the Ascians returned. Just think about it. Why would they write a story like Dawntrail, which culminates into a desperate struggle against a technologically superior adversary, without including the character whose sole ambition is to become technologically superior? And just to remind you, it's not like Kona's proficiency is ever downplayed. As a matter of fact, the plot goes to great lengths to emphasize how resourceful, capable, and talented Kona is when it comes to solving problems with inventions. Looking at everything that I've laid out, how can you possibly deny that this journey was meant for anyone but Kona? And had the story featured Kona instead of Wuk Lamat, then Dawntrail would have been immediately improved. The storytelling would have been more economical, requiring fewer logical and logistical leaps to justify character placement and motivation. The central conflict of the right would become more focused between 2 contrasting visions for the future, rather than featuring a vision for the future that boils down to maintaining the status quo. And of course, the totality of Dawntrail's themes are satisfied by presenting the setting of Solution 9 and the villain of Calyx as the Jungian shadow of the protagonist. It just makes sense. It's been well over a year since Dawntrail launched. In that time, I have come to terms with the fact that Final Fantasy XIV's story will forever be weighed down by this chapter in its ongoing development. I've been at peace with my growing suspicion that the story will probably fluctuate between mediocre and embarrassing for the remainder of its life service. And while I don't believe that placing Kona in the lead role of Dawntrail would have redeemed the expansion's plot, it is incredibly frustrating to realize that this middling story was ruined beyond repair by someone's insistence that Wuk Lamat should take center stage. And I think I know the reason. Now we arrive at the $17,000 question. Why? If what I'm saying is true, and Wuk Lamat's inclusion in Dawntrail was not only unnecessary, but totally contrived, then what reason would Creative Studio 3 have to shove her into the lead role? Some of you out there are thinking to yourselves, well, Ember, the answer is obvious. It's because of woke, BlackRock-funded NGOs pushing DEI and gender spectrum ideology to turn your wife gay and your dog trans. To that, I say this. If you truly believe that Yoshi P is meeting with the Bilderberg group in a shadowy room to figure out how to propagandize to the dwindling player base of Final Fantasy XIV in order to bring about a godless, genderless, bug-eating, pod-dwelling New World Order, then I have a gigantic bridge to sell you in Tuliola. I would invite you to rejoin us in reality, which is sadder and perhaps more insulting. Obviously, this entire video is speculation, but what I'm about to say will likely invite the most rejection. I fully accept that. Do your worst. Before I reveal my answer to the question of why hanging over this video, allow me to ask you this. What purpose does Wuk Lamat serve? Obviously, she is an expository device meant to act as a blank slate upon which the writers can introduce the players to these fascinating cultures such as Town Covered in Dirt and El Paso. The thing is, her ignorance is both unbelievable within the context of the story and insulting to the intelligence of the audience. Once upon a time, Final Fantasy XIV felt like real literature. Here was a game with enough text to make even the densest of visual novels blush. Yet each word felt finely crafted, lovingly placed, and deliberate, which made some of us forget that hours could pass without touching a keybind. Regional accents were carefully written into the dialogue, and the prose itself, while often verbose, was rich, substantial, and believable. In all of that reading, in all of those lines of text, there was trust. Trust from the writers to the players that we could handle dense language, face difficult themes, and grapple with complex moral quandaries. You see, in my opinion, Wuk Lamat represents a complete dissolution of that trust. Her presence in Dawntrail reveals that Creative Studio 3 no longer holds its players in the same regard that it once did. I'm not suggesting that they hate us. I'm suggesting that they no longer trust us to adequately engage with dense or challenging storytelling. Wuk Lamat is, as insulting as this may sound, a stand-in for you and me. She's ignorant because we're ignorant, and we're meant to witness the peoples and places of the new world through her eyes. And because the writers are suddenly and inexplicably courting general audiences, the substance of the content is ground to a nub, resulting in a script that reads like an inoffensive travel brochure. Once upon a time, 14's story seemed eager to challenge its players. I think of the betrayal by the Crystal Braves and the Scions of the Seventh Dawn being scattered to the winds. The consequences were heavy and permanent. Thancred lost his ability to manipulate ether, Y'shtola lost her sight, Minfilia ended up in another dimension. I remember thinking to myself, oh, true. No one is safe in this story, and even if these characters don't die, they could experience irrevocable change. I think of the moral quandary of Yotsuyu after she lost her memories, or the tenuous extension of peace that the Alamegans offered to Fordola, or the compelling justifications made by Varys in his meeting with the leaders of the Eorzean Alliance, or the brutality of Taslin's transformation into a Sin-Eater, or Quintus choosing death over dishonor. This story has demonstrated a willingness to challenge its audience, but challenge requires trust. Dawntrail lacks that signature challenge, so it follows too that it lacks trust. Now, all of the Scions are figuratively encased in amber. They could never earn new scars or have their perfectly preserved states altered by a new experience or an insurmountable challenge or a great tragedy. None of the characters that we encounter in our travels offer meaningful opposition to us, and they certainly don't raise challenging philosophical questions. Instead, Dawntrail gave us her, and I'm not entirely convinced that it was supposed to. Wuk Lamat is not just a badly written character set at the center of an ill-conceived expansion. She is a testament to the future of Final Fantasy XIV storytelling, which will be toothless, sanitized, inoffensive, and worst of all, boring. It's obvious that, after examining the complete plot of Dawntrail, Kona was meant to be the character with whom we journey. At this point, if you remain unconvinced, then I can't help you. Why do you think so many critical moments in the story had to happen off-screen? For example, we never got to see Wuk Lamat wrangle an alpaca because it would have been too late to animate that scene or build a gameplay scenario by the time the team decided to put Wuk Lamat into the story. It couldn't be more obvious that Wuk Lamat was desperately inserted into the game late into its development for fear of alienating modern audiences and potentially challenging them too much, something that Creative Studio 3 was never afraid of in the past. The box art for this expansion might as well have a massive neon sign that says, "We don't trust you to handle literature above a 3rd grade reading level." Here's a cooking competition where we keep the ideologically opposed characters separated from each other so as to not distract from the fascinating history of tacos. With all of that said, I rest my case. Wuk Lamat should never have existed, and if I'm right, she didn't. At least, not until the studio that gave us some of the greatest stories in the history of video games decided to write from a place of fear rather than from a place of trust. And that's the video, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for watching.